Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Get Healthy brand webinar this evening. I am your host, Dr. Tracy Stroup. I am the Chief Health and Growth Officer right here at Get Healthy Stores. And with me tonight is my good friend, Kara Seidman. She is going to be presenting on the behalf of gut microbes and GLP-1, the essential link for optimizing patient outcomes. I have a few slides to share before I introduce her officially, and Pendulum, who is our brand sponsor tonight. I was just telling Kara today, I was so impressed with our podcast recording that we did that I actually redid a PowerPoint and included Pendulum in it because of the amazing facts that you shared with me
That's
on
awesome.
all kinds of studies and clinical trials. Totally loved it. So I just
Awesome.
have a few slides to present tonight just to get everything going and rolling. Our Get Healthy updates, obviously. Catch us at the Integrative Health Symposium, IHS, February 20th. That'll be myself and Candace walking around, just making connections. So if you see us, please say hi. Des Bio, The Power of Three. We are actually going to be there on April 4th in Scottsdale, Arizona. Such a beautiful place. I went there last year. Professional Training event. I will actually be speaking at this conference on April 4th. This is in Clearwater, Florida. They do an incredible job, lots of fun. So if you're a practitioner, sign up because it sells out every single year. The Zymogen Experience, my first time going to be there in Dallas, Texas on April 12th. I'm excited to be there. And of course, ECO. This is Cellcore Biosciences, May 5th in the cute little town in Boise, Idaho, which I was pleasantly surprised, Kara. That was a great little place.
Yeah.
So guys, don't forget to sign up for our Get Healthy Educational Learning Management. We do put all of our brand webinars, all of our courses, including the 5-day Make $1,000 in a day, week, or month boot camp that was revolutionary for a lot of practitioners that participated. So if you can check that out, I would invite you to do so. So let's get started. Kara Seidman, welcome. She is the Senior Manager of Scientific Communications at Pendulum. I was recently reintroduced to this brand. I was introduced last year, and then you brought it forth again, Kara. And I have to say, I was so impressed. I'm really excited for this tonight because I think you shared just a lot of great information. So thank you for being here. I'm going to let you take over.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Okay, let me make sure I have everything silenced. And I'm excited to be here and talk more about Pendulum and Akkermansia and these next generation strains that I think, are playing such a key role, especially when talking about metabolic health, especially when talking about a lot of these concerns that are continuing to be on the rise. And so really to kind of nice segue into our talk today is really understanding the landscape and the current state of metabolic health. I mean, this is something that despite any advancements in technology, advancements in medication, we're continuing to see these conditions rise. So 1 in 3 American adults has metabolic syndrome. You can see the characteristics that are necessary to diagnose metabolic syndrome, but 1 in 6 American adults is diagnosed with diabetes. So we're more knowledgeable, we understand more about these conditions, but despite all that, they're continuing to rise. And we know metabolic syndrome and metabolic issues are associated with increases in other comorbidities. So cardiovascular disease and increased mortality, even gut-brain dysfunction, or even mental instability and changes to our mental well-being. And I think what we don't often talk about, right, we put such an emphasis on genes and in our environment, but we don't talk about the fact that these conditions are very much preventable, and we don't often think about the microbiome and its role in these conditions. And it's beyond just people who are diagnosed with diabetes or people who are having difficulty losing weight or diagnosed with obesity. It's important to really highlight that these conditions are really often showing signs so much earlier than when they actually get diagnosed. And having metabolic dysfunction or being metabolically unfit doesn't mean that you have a diagnosis of metabolic syndrome or even diabetes, that you may be suffering from things like chronic pain and changes to your energy levels and brain fog and changes to your appetite, more cravings, difficulty losing weight, again, those mood changes. These are all early and very important signs that indicate that something is not in balance and that we are potentially not metabolically fit. And the sad truth and sort of some of the alarming statistics is that 88% of Americans, so only 12% of Americans are actually considered to be metabolically healthy. And that's pretty alarming. And when we think about those statistics, it just offers a really exciting area for us practitioners and those of us who are working in this area of medicine to really start to work on improving our metabolic health. And we know that some of what's contributing to this, aside from obviously other lifestyle factors, but the state of our grocery store, we know that more than 70% of our items are considered to be ultra processed. There's a lot coming out on ultra processed foods and how this damages the microbiome. And more than 75% of our healthcare spending is actually spent on chronic metabolic diseases. So a lot of efforts are being put towards metabolic health. And like I said, we don't often think about the role of the gut microbiome. It really offers a very exciting area for intervention that plays such a key role in our metabolic health. And so obviously with the continued rise in our metabolic fitness and the continued increase in metabolic syndrome and associated disorders, we've seen this drastic shift in medications for metabolic health, and specifically with the rise of GLP-1 receptor agonists. So I'm sure everyone here has heard of GLP-1, and we're going to get into a little bit more of it. I know none of us are living under a rock, and we work with many patients who are utilizing these medications, and they've been wildly successful. And there's a reason for it. It's a very, very important hormone. And we know that part of the success of these medications really roots back to the fact that GLP-1, and what most people don't realize is that it's actually produced by the gut microbiome. So this is a hormone that plays a very essential role and a very important role in regulating our blood glucose levels, in maintaining our appetite and slowing that digestive emptying. It's also important for the gut barrier, which we'll talk a lot about. And so when we think about GLP-1 and how to really optimize our own body's metabolic processes, the microbiome is key because GLP-1 is produced in the microbiome. And so just to take a moment, because I think we often sort of equate the two to each other, sort of the difference between natural GLP-1 that our own body produces versus pharmacological, or what we're used to seeing now a lot in the media and with our patients and kind of all around us are these GLP-1 receptor agonists. So natural or endogenous GLP-1, right? This is secreted by our gut endocrine cells, our intestinal L cells, and this is in response to food intake. So this really sort of follows a natural rhythm of food. Now, our natural GLP-1 has a very, very short half-life, only about 2 to 3 minutes. So that means that it's very quickly broken down in the body after it's released. And that's why the body needs to produce it at, sort of continuous levels in response to what we're eating. And that's why that it's, we talk about natural GLP-1, it's produced at these sort of physiological quantities that those changes and those dynamic level changes are really in response to what we're eating, how much we're eating, and of course, the state and status of our microbiome, which we'll get into more. Whereas exogenous GLP-1, so what's administered externally, right? We're used to learning about or hearing about Ozempic and Wegovy and Mounjaro, what we're kind of constantly being, talked about. These exogenous GLP-1 or GLP-1 receptor agonists, these have a much, much longer half-life, which is why they're only a once a week injectable. And they're really maintaining these sort of artificially elevated levels that it's really at a dose that's, 10 times the physiological level that our body produces. And that's really to maintain a prolonged and therapeutic benefit from these medications. So with that, because it's a much, much higher concentration, we're of course met with potentially unwanted or unpleasant side effects, usually related to gastrointestinal, that slowing of the digestive tract, reflux and bloating and abdominal pain. But then there's also this risk and this higher likelihood, and there's been many studies that have come out looking at this, the amount of weight that's regained, within a year of stopping these medications. And so a lot of what we're thinking about when looking at the microbiome, since this is where GLP-1 is produced, is how can we not just support people even along this journey, but how do we really start to pay attention to what's happening in the microbiome so that we can have better response to these medications, especially when transitioning off. And so if we can really look to promoting the body's natural GLP-1 production through our diet, through modulation of the microbiome, this can actually really help with more sustained long-term metabolic improvements. And so with the GLP-1 agonists and with the medications, there are microbiome related concerns that we're often met with, which is of course gastrointestinal distress. So obviously unwanted side effects. There's also, lack of energy just because we're not able to take in sufficient amount of intake. So how can we help to support our microbiome if we're not taking in enough, from the diet? But also there's changes in food cravings as medications are either dosed up or as we start to get used to the dose that we're at. So how can we continue to manage those cravings and help with the support um, in maintaining the success that people are actually seeing on these medications? So we don't often think about the microbiome. We don't often consider this a key player when looking at sort of this metabolic consortium and looking at metabolic conditions. And it's really something that we need to consider more often and maybe even earlier in our intervention pathway when working with metabolically challenged patients. And in fact, there have been research studies that have come out that if you can support the health of your gut microbiome and modulate the microbiome when people are on weight loss interventions or weight loss medications or even gastric bypass, that we often see better results. And so we know the microbiome is part of this big picture. So we've really, in terms of this sort of metabolic microbiome crosstalk, this was a landmark study that was done back in 2013 that really sort of hit the nail on the head and honed in on the microbiome's role. And it's a study that gets referenced quite often. And so this was a study that looked at or took the microbiome from an obese woman and transplanted that microbiome into a lean mouse. And that lean mouse then became obese. So pretty incredible. Just by changing the microbes and modulating that, we're seeing then a different outcome and a metabolic outcome in terms of weight. They then took the microbiome from a lean woman and transplanted it into an obese mouse, and that obese mouse then became lean. So again, seeing that microbiome modulation, okay, there's some connection there. They took that lean mouse, that newly lean mouse's microbiome, transplanted it into the newly obese mouse, and that obese mouse then went back to being lean. So pretty incredible to see how just shifting of the microbes by changing the state of the microbiome that we're seeing these metabolic outcomes. And what was so fascinating about this study was these two women were actually identical twins. So genetically they're the same. So we're beyond now this thinking of, oh, our genes and our environment are what's precipitating or predisposing us to these conditions, and that the microbiome is really at the center and truly kind of the foundation. And so I really like to think of our microbiome as our foundation. If you've ever heard me talk or you ever listen to me, I think of the microbiome really like, the foundation to a home. And, you may find the most perfect home, the biggest home, the beautiful, it has everything you've ever wanted, but we wait very patiently for that inspection and the structural report to come back so that we find out that there's no cracks in our foundation. Because if there are, then our home isn't as stable. It's not going to be as resilient. And so that's really kind of how we think of the microbiome. But the question often comes up is, what is a healthy microbiome or what is considered a healthy microbiome? And interestingly enough, we don't really have this sort of perfect signature or microbial profile that represents a healthy microbiome. What we have are sort of these core characteristics or key components that we know are necessary for a well-functioning microbiome. And so these characteristics include having diversity, lots of diversity. So we know that as with industrialization, with westernization, changes in our diets, that we're starting to see diversity really come down. These are studies that have been done on African tribes, Burkina Faso, Hazda tribe, where they've got, over 700, 1,000 different species. And when we look at sort of westernization and with the Western diet and Western world, we're seeing 200 and below. And for any of us who do any type of stool testing, we see that looking at alpha diversity, so just the quantity of our species. So we're seeing this loss of diversity, but a healthy microbiome has really a good abundance, but in particular, we have good abundance of these key health promoting species, keystone species, which we'll talk about, Akkermansia muciniphila, but also our short chain fatty acid producing species. And this is what really helps to maintain a healthy mucosal layer. We're going to talk a lot about the mucosal barrier, our security perimeter, our fence that protects our microbiome and protects our immune system. So if we have these things in place, we have these strong, very well-formed, tight junctions. Your individual fence posts are tightly in place and very well put. This is ultimately what creates a very stable and resilient microbiome where it can perform all the necessary functions. And we know our microbiome plays an essential role in nutrient absorption, digestion, gut-brain function, breakdown of toxins and xenobiotics. So we know our microbiome has so many different functions in the body, defending us against harmful microorganisms. The problem arises when we get exposed to various factors, which we'll talk about. And so as we get exposed to various factors, what I like to call microbiome disruptors, this really pushes us into a more dysbiotic state, or a state where our microbiome is imbalanced. And so we have more harmful bacteria. We have this sort of reduced abundance of our healthy and commensal bacteria. We start to lose abundance of these key health promoting species, Akkermansia, your short chain fatty acid producing species. And this is essentially what starts to break down your mucosal barriers. Our fence is getting knocked out. And so my dog, who loves to run around outside, now he's free and can go anywhere, right? Which I don't want to happen. And when that mucosal barrier gets broken down, we start to see a loss of those tight junctions, so they become more compromised. And that leads to a reduced gut barrier function. And now bacterial toxins can seep into systemic circulation, can translocate right through that intestinal barrier. And this is known as intestinal permeability, or leaky gut. And so toxins like lipopolysaccharides, these can now get into systemic circulation and really start to activate the immune system and drive inflammation. And so throughout our life, we're constantly exposed to all these different external factors that shift our healthy, core microbiome that's, generally very stable, and starts to shift it to a more transient and less stable state. So everything from chronic stress to, mode of delivery starts to, set the stage for our microbiome life cycle stage. So as we move through different life cycles, especially menopause for women, this is a time of life that is marked by decreased diversity, and definitely low diversity of these very health promoting species, low Akkermansia, which we'll talk about. Medications from antibiotics, we know, kind of decimate the microbiome. Proton pump inhibitors create changes to the microbiome. Of course, our diet being the biggest microbiome modulator of all time. And so none of us are immune to these. And the issues arise that as we start to get more exposed to these microbiome disruptors, or, the winds and the hurricanes and the bomb cyclones that we know can disrupt our structure, we then can ultimately see manifestations that are not just happening in the gut. So manifestations like obviously GI dysfunction, but manifestations beyond, from energy to metabolic changes to brain dysfunction like brain fog and anxiety, and changes to our mental well-being, immune dysfunction, hormone imbalance. And so the mucosal barrier really is this front line of our innate defense. And it's the barrier that, our security perimeter that coats our GI tract. I love this image. This comes from a very famous microbiome lab, Justin Sonnenberg, and really just gives a beautiful depiction. So you can see here all these little sprinkles that I like to call, this is your bacteria, this is your microbiome. You've got your Firmicutes, your Bacteroidetes there. And this is our mucosal barrier. So our mucosal barrier is sort of in our large intestines, 2 layers thick. We have this outer layer where we see some microbes, and actually the health of the mucosal barrier really relies on the presence of specific microbial species. And then you have this inner mucosal barrier, which is actually sterile. It's one of the only sterile parts of the body. We really have identified, bacteria and things in our blood and urine and even in amniotic fluid. And so we really don't have sterile parts of the body except for this area. And there's a reason for it, because this blue layer that you see here, this is your epithelium. So that 1 cell layer thick of those epithelial cells that protects your lamina propria, your immune system, right? 70% of our immune system is contained in the GI tract. So if you have a breakdown in this mucosal barrier, that's not a good thing, because your epithelium and your immune system is not being protected. And this can be disrupted by different bacteria and pathogens and opportunistic bacteria, toxins like lipopolysaccharides, inflammatory signals. And so when that breakdown happens and we get this translocation of toxins, and specifically lipopolysaccharides, which are components on the outer cell membrane of your gram-negative bacteria, lipopolysaccharides can become very inflammatory and immunogenic and naturally circulate at very low levels in the body. But when you have a breakdown in this mucosal barrier, when you have that intestinal permeability and LPSs get through that translocation, get into systemic circulation, this is a driver of low-grade chronic inflammation. So for many of us that are, worked in clinical practice, sepsis is due to LPSs at extremely high levels. But chronic low-grade inflammation is very, very, very low-grade sepsis, which is a term known as metabolic endotoxemia. And so this is characterized by an increase in inflammatory markers, interleukin-6, interleukin-1 beta, a rise in triglycerides and postprandial insulin. And what has been really looked at in the research is this metabolic endotoxemia, this translocation of LPS, and LPS that can sort of breach that barrier and get into systemic circulation. This is really a driver for so many of our chronic conditions, from cardiovascular disease to obesity. LPS can cross blood-brain barrier and start to drive mood disorders. So lipopolysaccharides, really looked at as a triggering factor. This was a very early study done by the American Diabetes Association. I love this study because we know the American Diabetes Association is pretty conventional, and this was done actually back in 2007. So kind of at the start and rise in the sort of microbiome research realm. And basically what this study was is chicken or egg. Is LPS driving, and this sort of rise in inflammatory markers and low-grade inflammation driving obesity and insulin resistance, or is obesity and insulin resistance then driving this breakdown and intestinal permeability? And actually what they found was that metabolic endotoxemia was really identified before these changes in insulin levels. So we're seeing changes in the microbiome and components from the microbiome prior to diabetes and prior to insulin resistance. And so the breakdown of that mucosal barrier and that loss of integrity is truly ground zero for so many of our chronic conditions, and metabolic disorders being one. And so this was a study that looked at sort of non-communicable diseases being the primary cause of absence and morbidity and mortality. And these are things like diabetes and autoimmune disorders. And so we really know and understand now that the gut microbiome and our mucosal health is key in preventing systemic-wide inflammation. And so probiotics and prebiotics, of course, modifying the diet, become very important in managing this and in helping to ensure the health of the gut microbiome. And so when we look to, what specific probiotics and what strains, what functions are really needed in order to have a healthy metabolism, it really comes down to the production of these short chain fatty acids. We're going to talk about butyrate, but also strengthening and really securing and fortifying the gut barrier, preventing that permeability, preventing that translocation of lipopolysaccharides. But we also need to make sure that we're optimizing that natural GLP-1 production, because we're seeing that as that microbiome is disrupted, as we're losing these key species, as we're in a more dysbiotic state, we are not optimizing, we're not getting those optimal levels of endogenous or natural GLP-1 production. And so that's really where Pendulum and where, our efforts and, our scientists and researchers and founders really put emphasis in, through the ability to, now better study the microbiome and through next generation technology, in being able to not just identify these key strains that we know are playing an integral role in our metabolic health, but really being able to study them, identify them, and bring them to market. And so at Pendulum, we manufacture 5 different next generation strains. So these are different than your traditional lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. And these are strains that are actually naturally part of a healthy microbiome. And the problem is that with all these microbiome disruptors and the exposome that we're exposed to, these levels are diminishing and they're decreasing, and we're losing the abundance, and we're starting to see the health manifestations and imbalances, take place. So we manufacture live Akkermansia and muciniphila. We have 3 butyrate producers: Clostridium butyricum, Clostridium beijerinii, as well as anaerobe butyricum howlei. And then we also have Bifidobacterium infantis, which is a primary fermenter. So really important in being that sort of initial microbe that breaks down your dietary fibers, so that Akkermansia and your butyrate producers can then further break them down into our short chain fatty acids. So let's get into Akkermansia. This is really kind of considered the shining star of the gut microbiome. And when we look at Akkermansia research throughout the years, you can just see this kind of perfect hockey stick style increase, because so many groups and so many researchers in the microbiome space are interested in Akkermansia because of its profound influence on the health of the microbiome, and not just in metabolic health, but you can see all the various conditions and a lot of research being focused now on Akkermansia related to gut-brain dysfunction. So what is Akkermansia? It's a keystone species or a keystone strain. So people ask, like, what does a keystone species mean? So this is something that exists in all ecosystems, but keystone strains, they don't necessarily take up the most amount of real estate. They're not the greatest abundance. So Akkermansia only takes up about 1 to 4% of a healthy microbiome, but it has a disproportionate impact on the overall health. So I think of it as like the star player. I'm not sure if you are all into sports, but think of it as like LeBron James or Michael Jordan of, a basketball team. Like, if they don't show up for a game, there's a much greater chance that the team's going to lose. So that's how we think of Akkermansia, as kind of that star player. And what's unique about Akkermansia, which we'll talk about, is it lives within the mucosal barrier, lives within that mucosal layer. So remember what I said, it's 2 layers thick. That outer mucosal layer, there's really not many microbes that live there. And Akkermansia is unique in that it lives in that layer because it can actually consume old mucin, which we'll talk about. And we found that levels of Akkermansia decrease as we age, but we've also seen that low Akkermansia levels are associated with various conditions from metabolic dysfunction to neurological disorders to even osteoporosis and different cancers and gut barrier dysfunction. And so we don't diagnose based on microbes, but we see these profiles that are very prominent or prevalent with different conditions. And so it's really interesting to see now with Akkermansia beyond sort of the metabolic realm, what else is being linked to. So what is Akkermansia doing? How is Akkermansia the shining star? Why do we think of it as, LeBron James? So Akkermansia, again, is unique. It lives in that mucosal layer. And so it consumes mucin. So it's not necessarily relying on what's coming in through the diet, although Akkermansia does consume polyphenols, which we'll talk about, but it's consuming that old mucin. And through that consumption of old mucin, it's stimulating the production of very important metabolites known as, or signals. And so there's three in particular, one being this AMUC 1100. So it's consuming mucin, it's releasing this AMUC 1100, and that binds to receptors on our intestinal cells that stimulate our goblet cells, which are the cells that produce mucin, to produce new mucin. So it's like a little worker bee that's constantly fortifying those fence posts. We also see AMUC 11 helping to stimulate interleukin 10, which is our anti-inflammatory cytokine, so it helps with immune homeostasis. Akkermansia also produces propionate being our short-chain fatty acid, one of our key short-chain fatty acids, but propionate will also feed our butyrate-producing bacteria. So Akkermansia is a cross-feeder, promotes the growth of other butyrate-producing bacteria, and even ones that we produce, Clostridium, butyricum, anaerobutyricum hali. And butyrate binds to certain receptors on your intestinal L cells that stimulate the production of GLP-1. And then finally, Akkermansia produces a very unique protein known as P9. P9 binds to different receptors on your intestinal L cells that also promotes the production of GLP-1. So we're getting sort of this threefold effect. We're getting this gut barrier integrity and repair, which we know helps to prevent translocation of bacteria and toxins like LPS, but we're also getting this simultaneous production of GLP-1. So if we don't have Akkermansia or Akkermansia is low, then that's really a biomarker now for poor intestinal barrier integrity. So we start to see the thinning of that mucosal barrier. We're not getting that fortification. And that's what really lends itself to intestinal inflammation, driving the infiltration of the LPSs and really driving that metabolic endotoxemia. Now, oftentimes we get asked, what's the difference between live Akkermansia and pasteurized or dead Akkermansia or postbiotic Akkermansia? And I think this is a really interesting topic because we're really finding that, as bacteria die, they still maintain some of their benefits. But I really like to think of it as the difference between eating an apple versus drinking apple juice. So apple juice, you may still get some vitamins and minerals, right? You're still getting the glucose and fructose and energy from it, but you're not getting everything that apple intended to have. You're not getting the fibers and the pectins. You're not getting the polyphenols necessarily. So live Akkermansia, you're getting that consumption of mucin. If you have dead or pasteurized or postbiotic Akkermansia, you do get the production of one of those metabolites, that AMUC 1100, but that's it. So you're not actually getting the stimulation of GLP-1. So you lose sort of the metabolic benefits. And so there's been a lot of studies looking at Akkermansia's benefits on metabolic health. This is a study that, I love this study because they actually found in this study that obese subjects who we would maybe look at as being not metabolically fit, obese subjects that actually had higher Akkermansia were more metabolically healthy. So we don't want to judge a book by its cover. And ultimately, we're in the field of medicine to really improve people's health status. And so I really like this, that even though someone may have a higher, BMI or maybe have a little bit more weight on them, that actually if their levels are higher of Akkermansia, they're more metabolically fit, which is very exciting to see how our microbiome is improving our overall health status, and despite maybe someone not being at that ideal weight. And this was a study out of the American Gut Project, so a huge cohort that looked at those with higher relative abundance of Akkermansia, despite age and all those external factors, were actually at a lower risk of obesity. Now, we also produce Clostridium butyricum, and this is a very prominent butyrate producer. Butyrate is that main currency of the microbial world. It's really one of the most important metabolites produced in the body and has profound influence throughout the entire body, but does play a key role in our metabolic health. But we also know that low butyrate is associated with colorectal cancer and autoimmune conditions and inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel syndrome, obviously metabolic dysfunction. And so Clostridium butyricum plays a very important function through its butyrate production. So obviously it's helping to sort of comb the GI environment and support the growth of other butyrate producing bacteria. but it also produces interleukin 10, our anti-inflammatory cytokine, so really helping with that immune homeostasis. But butyrate also helps with production of GLP-1. This was a study I love. I like this because this was a study that looked at statin use, and there's been a lot of studies that have come out with people who are taking statins and how that can change certain levels in the body. Now, I like this because we know so many people are taking statins, and this isn't a conversation of whether or not we should be on certain medications or not. That's for a conversation for another day. But what we have to start to think about is how some of these common medications that we see our patients and our clients on, how could they be impacting the microbiome for better or worse? And this was a study that looked at statins and actually that statins increase the risk of type 2 diabetes. And part of the reason is because it's creating more dysbiosis, but it's decreasing these Clostridium species like Clostridium butyricum, which are bile acid metabolizers. So one of the jobs and functions of these bile acid metabolizers is to actually take our primary bile acids, so CDCA, and convert to our secondary bile acids, UTGA. And we know that that helps with also GLP-1 production. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So we have to start to think about these patients that may be taking medications. What do we need to support them? Because maybe they're on it for a reason and they want to be on it, they need to be on it. But how can we support their microbiome when these medications could be impacting some of the levels of these beneficial bacteria? And so the question really becomes, how can we utilize strains like Akkermansia muciniphila, Clostridium butyricum to enhance not just the health of the gut microbiome, but really improve that communication between the gut microbiome and our metabolic health? And so this was a study that we did. This was a 12-week clinical trial. And this was a study on our 5-strain formulation. So this is with our Pendulum glucose control. So all 5 strains that we mentioned, Akkermansia, Clostridium butyricum, Clostridium beijeriniki, Bifidobacterium infantis, Anaerobutyricum hallei. And we looked at across the board, changes in blood sugar, area under the curve, so glucose spikes. We also looked at A1C. And what we found after 12 weeks of this study that those that were taking Pendulum glucose control, so all 5 of the strains, actually had significant reduction in glucose spikes, so 33% reduction in glucose spikes. And we saw a change in A1C and a reduction in A1C by 0.6, which is really incredible. I mean, clinically meaningful, enough to take someone from being diabetic to pre-diabetic, pre-diabetic to non-diabetic. So really powerful. We also saw, of course, that it was safe, it was well tolerated. And so just by modulating the microbiome, really no other changes. These people were on a standardized, meal test. They drank 2 boost shakes, so everyone was eating the same thing. And so really in a clinical setting, seeing this profound change by just modulating the microbiome. And then we did a follow-up to that study to really understand a little bit more of the mechanism behind it. So remember that statin study that we talked about, how statins contribute to dysbiosis because of the loss of these Clostridium species that's really leading to this sort of dysregulated bile acid metabolism. So what we looked at in this study was looking at plasma butyrate levels, really understanding that the role of Clostridium butyricum in converting primary bile acid to secondary bile acid UTGA, that actually blocks our FXR receptor, and that really helps to encourage the promotion of GLP-1. So not just the binding of butyrate to our intestinal L cells, but also this conversion of primary bile acids to secondary bile acids. So we're seeing sort of multiple mechanisms involved in lowering of the blood glucose and the A1C change that we saw. We also did a food survey. This was a consumer survey on over 270 participants. This was a survey that participants were taking our GLP-1 probiotics. So they were taking Akkermansia muciniphila, Clostridium butyricum, and then Bifidobacterium infantis. And this was looking at cravings across the board. And what we found in this study was, and I love these real world evidence because this is not in a clinical setting. So it's people living their normal day-to-day life, eating their day-to-day diet, dealing with the day-to-day stressors, living just kind of normal as can be. What happens when you take this probiotic, our GLP-1 probiotic? And after 6 weeks, so at that 6-week mark, this was a 3-month study, but by 6 weeks, 91% of our participants reported reduced food cravings, which is really exciting because that's part of the role of GLP-1 is, we think of GLP-1 as really aiding in weight loss, but that's really the GLP-1 receptor agonist. And remember, you're taking that at such a higher therapeutic dose that GLP-1 in the body is helping with blood sugar control, and it's helping with really telling your body, right? It binds to receptors in our brain saying, hey, you're full. It slows digestive emptying so that our meals become we become more satisfied and satiated. So really cool to see that those food cravings reduced, that people reported less food noise. We also saw that people who reported higher food cravings, so the people who had the highest food cravings at baseline, actually experienced the greatest reduction in their food cravings at that 6-week mark. So very interesting there. And then don't worry, if you crave sweets or you crave fats or you crave salty food like me, there was more than 80% reduction across the board in each category. So again, just showing that it's not necessarily, oh, particular to sweets, that really GLP-1 in the body that's helping to quiet that food noise is helping to improve our metabolic state, which again, metabolic dysfunction can, one of the signs of it is food cravings. And that can be a very early sign. Or I like to think about those patients even that like so many of my patients that I've worked with that are really doing a lot of things. They're changing their diet, they're exercising, and they're just having that difficulty losing weight. That's not someone who's metabolically fit. So we really have to start to consider the microbiome then as part of that equation. How can we start to incorporate these next generation strains in improving and adding back in these very important microbes that function to increase these very important hormones that really regulate our blood sugar, our appetite, our cravings, help us feel full. So here at Pendulum, we have our Pendulum Pro line. So this is our exclusive line of probiotics designed specifically for healthcare providers. It's unique. It's got a 2-year shelf life. It's in a premium desiccant lined packaging. So this is really there to ensure that the probiotics are not seeing any moisture. These are very fragile strains. I didn't talk about it too much in this webinar, but the strains that we manufacture at Pendulum are strict anaerobes. They do not survive in the presence of oxygen, which has made it very difficult, to bring them to market. And this is what Pendulum, spent over 10 years doing R&D research prior to even launching their first probiotic to figure out not only how to maintain viability, but to then produce at, mass quantities. And so this desiccant line packaging is really helping to ensure that stability and viability. We also have different dosing options so that you can really tailor how you're utilizing our probiotics and these strains for your patients. So we have 2 different doses of Akkermansia. We have our Akkermansia 100. This is a lower dose, so this is really meant to kind of maintain. I really think about this as a dose starting, patients off who are maybe very, very, very sensitive. I know as practitioners, we never want our patients to feel worse because then they lose trust in us. So if we have concern over those very sensitive patients, sometimes it's nice starting on single dose Akkermansia and even lower dose before moving up. Akkermansia 500, this is really meant to kind of replenish those who are either low, not detected, or you have very strong signs of intestinal permeability and gut barrier dysfunction. Starting at Akkermansia 500 is really great. So this is maximum strength. This is really there to help repair the gut barrier. And I'm a really big fan of starting with single strain. I sort of think of this is my own language, but I sort of think of this as like priming of the land, like sort of like farming, right? We've got to till the land. We've got to get it ready to plant the seeds. So I think of sort of single strain Akkermansia as that. We're really looking at repairing the gut barrier, preventing that translocation before transitioning to a multi-strain probiotic. Sometimes when we go on multi-strain probiotics, people often feel changes. That's not a bad thing. It means that it's doing something. But if you have a lot of pathogens, if you have a lot of opportunistic bacteria that bring in a lot of alkalinity, there's a lot of changes to that GI environment. So part of what probiotics do, and especially these strains, they bring in acidity. And so we can feel that, right? That die-off or that Herx reaction. So I love starting with single strain as a way to sort of then jumpstart and then get into a multi-strain. And I think people see more clinical benefits and as you get a little bit more clinical meaningfulness when working with modulation of the microbiome. But we do have multi-strain formulations that have various amounts of our 5 strains. So we have our Metabolic Daily Pro. This is our 5 strains that we manufacture. It's half the dose of our Pendulum Glucose Control, which is our highest dose formulation. That's what our clinical trial was on. This is really, meant to truly shift the metabolic state. So I love starting with glucose control when you're really wanting to see the greatest A1C change. You're really wanting to try to shift the blood sugars. And our Metabolic Daily Pro is a great 4-in-1 sort of daily general probiotic. And then we have our GLP-1 probiotic. This is exclusive to healthcare practitioners. And this contains Clostridium, butyricum, Akkermansia, muciniphila, Bifidobacterium infantis. This is what we did our food craving survey on. And so there are various ways that we see practitioners utilizing this probiotic. These strains are very helpful in managing GI symptoms. So if we are working with patients who are on GLP-1 receptor agonists and we're really wanting them to maintain that and see the benefits, we know that modulating the microbiome is so helpful in improving and sustaining those results and actually achieving better results. But these can help with GI-related side effects. We have a lot of providers that are utilizing GLP-1 probiotic to help manage side effects while taking GLP-1 agonists. It can help with nutritional deficits. So these strains bringing, again, when we're on these medications, we're not able to consume enough, which is why we see those side effects like hair loss and lack of energy, because we're just not taking in enough nutrients. And so by, again, bringing these helpful strains, these next generation strains back in, we can really help to support the microbiome when we're not bringing enough in from our diet, but also helping to manage cravings. So as you're dosing up or as you're transitioning people off, we have a lot of providers who are getting people started on this well before transitioning off GLP-1 medications to manage those cravings. That's really one of the biggest issues when we get off of GLP-1 receptor agonists, is that those cravings come right back because you're stopping that intense dose. So if we can get this started, 90 days, even more prior to transitioning off, we have a much better chance of really dampening and quieting that food noise and maintaining that reduction in food cravings. We also have our polyphenol booster. Polyphenols, I'm such a big fan of polyphenols. They are prebiotics, but specifically polyphenols are non-fiber forms. So they're very GI tolerable. So especially if you're working with patients that have GI dysfunction, SIBO, irritable bowel syndrome, sometimes we have to be very cautious when we're adding back in fibers and prebiotic fibers in particular. So polyphenols are nice because it's a way to really give support to the microbiome and help support the GI environment. But we know polyphenols, and specifically the polyphenols that we added in pomegranate extract, grapeseed extract, green tea extract, really helps to bolster Akkermansia levels and helps to support the growth. And we looked at various polyphenols against our Akkermansia strain, and our Akkermansia actually chose these polyphenols. So I like to think of it as a precision polyphenol, and it pairs well with any of our probiotics. Again, this really helps to work with our strains to stimulate also that GLP-1 production. So just looking at a couple protocols, and then we'll wrap up here for some questions if there are any. But how do we start to support the gut barrier? That's where Akkermansia is really great. And as I mentioned before, I love starting with Akkermansia prior to transitioning to a multi-strain probiotic, because it really does help support sort of that building of the gut barrier. It's 6 o'clock here if you guys hear my daughters coming in the background. But really helps to bring support to that gut barrier, start to fortify that fence so that our microbiome is being protected as well as our immune system. We also always like to encourage the addition of the polyphenols because that supports that growth. Akkermansia can also consume polyphenols. So this really helps to build up that natural abundance and help to support that abundance within the microbiome. Akkermansia 100, again, is great with starting with those very sensitive GI patients, where then you can increase to Akkermansia 500, or oftentimes starting with Akkermansia 500 is fine too. People who have metabolic dysfunction, where we're really wanting to see that shift in their metabolic state, pendulum glucose control is great, especially starting using that for that 3-month period at least, where we see that shift in A1C from our clinical trial. And it's great then to transition to our Metabolic Daily Pro as a general probiotic, a step down to pendulum glucose control. We also like to add the polyphenols again. That's kind of there to booster all of our strains. And then finally, our GLP-1 probiotics. So again, there's ways of sort of utilizing this. I often, will, have people add this in again, depending on what phase they're in, or trialing this out before they even start GLP-1 medications to see if we can start to optimize the microbiome and support that production of GLP-1. And then oftentimes, if we're working with patients and we're starting them on their GLP-1 journey, I love starting with Akkermansia 500 because, again, people that have metabolic dysfunction, obesity, type 2 diabetes, they have distinct microbial profiles where they have this loss of abundance. They are losing those, they don't have those short chain fatty acid species. They have intestinal permeability. So let's start to improve that. Let's, sort of till the land before we plant the seeds so that we can really help to, bolster that growth and really improve the overall health. So I love starting with Akkermansia 500 for anywhere from 1 to 3 months, and then I'll transition them to GLP-1 Pro while on GLP-1 medications, and then through that transition in addition to our polyphenol booster. So with that, hopefully, everyone's listening and I didn't talk too fast, but happy to answer any questions that there are.
I have
Yeah.
questions. So can you touch again on the short chain fatty acid production with the butyrate, and why would you choose this path over just giving a straight butyrate?
I love that question. And there's nothing wrong with giving butyrate. You're giving the end product of fermentation. So I spent 10 years working in gastroenterology, and used butyrate for very specific reasons when my IBD patients that were in flares and really needing to get the benefits of butyrate because they're probably not having enough production. But butyrate isn't necessarily going to impact the health of the microbiome. It's not going to support the growth of your beneficial species. So there's nothing wrong with giving butyrate, but you're not going to get the modulation that we want to see in the microbiome. And so it's important that we're still adding back in these strains, these butyrate producers, improving the overall health, improving the gut barrier, all these things that really make up a healthy microbiome so that we're really optimizing our microbiome's function. So just giving that end product, again, you're going to get the benefits of butyrate, but you're not going to improve the function of your microbiome.
Awesome. And when you were talking about the statins, was that study done? Did you find that cholesterol lowered with giving it was Clostridium, is that correct?
Clostridium butyricum. So we didn't look at cholesterol. That was not a marker that we measured. But in the statin paper, it was looking at blood sugar and diabetes risk primarily. Yeah.
And what that strain in particular is in which formulas?
Clostridium butyricum is in all of our formulas.
All of them,
Yeah.
except for the isolated Akkermansia.
Except for the Akkermansia and of course our polyphenol booster. But our Pendulum Metabolic Daily Pro, our Glucose Control Pro, and GLP-1 all have Clostridium butyricum. And Clostridium butyricum, I love this. It's also been studied a lot for GI dysfunction, which I think is what makes it such a great companion to in helping to improve GI distress.
Yeah, absolutely. And the dosage of these, when you give your protocols, are you starting with one capsule a
Mm-hmm.
day or
Yeah.
is that
So
one cap?
all of our probiotics are one capsule per day, with the exception of our Pendulum Glucose Control Pro. That's 2 capsules per day. And that's what we used in our clinical trial and where we saw the 33%
At
reduction.
any time or?
So great question. And I love this question. We recommend taking probiotics with food. I generally always recommend taking probiotics with food. Food acts as a buffer. We also
Mhm.
know that protein and fat help to raise the pH, so helps make, a more hospitable environment for our probiotics. But also when we eat, that encourages peristalsis and movement so that we can get those probiotics to where they want to go. So I always tell patients and clients, if you're not eating or you forget, take them. It's still a good thing, but if we can take it with food, there's that symbiotic relationship. I think we're going to always see better results.
Yeah, that's always a question, right? It's the battle. It's like empty stomach with food, empty stomach.
Yeah.
So it's good to hear that there's a reason behind you're saying take with food. It works better.
Absolutely.
Better.
Yeah, I
So
mean, unless you're taking, postbiotics that like butyrate, or you're taking, dead bacteria where it just doesn't matter, um, then it's fine. But even still with postbiotics, I would still recommend, because food helps to, again, like depending on the role of that, it helps to get that peristalsis, that motility. It gets things to where it needs to go.
okay, totally get that. And then you said these are kind of anaerobic species. After you receive the product, just for practitioners listening, my clients always ask me, do they have to be in the refrigerator? Would you recommend refrigerating after
Hmm.
opening?
Yep. So these are strict anaerobes. Now, our sort of viability and stability is really happening before it gets encapsulated. It's these this is again part of that sort of R&D, that how do we preserve these strict anaerobes in, we have oxygen all around us. And so there's actually a process, it's called lyophilization, where they get sort of in this suspended animation and all the moisture gets taken out. And then they are in an acid coated enteric coated capsule, so it can resist your stomach acid. And then, essentially get to your intestine where it can open up and start to exert its benefits. But we do recommend, so they are shelf stable, and it's because of that process before encapsulation. But we do recommend probiotics to be refrigerated unless they're in a dormant form, like a spore form, or they're dead. Most probiotics you're going to preserve and really help to, just extend that viability if you put it in the refrigerator, right? Outside, our temperatures are changing. Think about even fermentation, right? You put things in the refrigerator, it stops the ripening process, it stops the fermentation process. So again, it's just going to preserve that. So we do recommend keeping it in the refrigerator, but they are shelf stable. Our Pendulum Pro line has a 2-year shelf life.
So I just want to give a little example of the power of the Akkermansia, and I told Kara this on the podcast,
I
but this
love
is
this.
not an opinion of Pendulum. This is my personal experience with the product. I'm not making any claims of curing, treating, or diagnosing, but it was actually an amazing thing to see. So I have a client, he's 6 years old. Um, his parents brought him to me. He has Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. His CK levels were around 50,000. So for people who don't understand DMD, that means that your creatine kinase, which is an enzyme found in your muscles, it plays a key role in like your energy metabolism. And when you measure CK levels in the blood, it's to assess how much muscle damage, inflammation, and stress, basically wasting of what's happening. So the higher the CK level, the more damage, the more oxidative stress, et cetera. So put him on a protocol, went for about 3 months, got his levels down to around 30,000. We're in contact with all his other allopathic doctors. The parents wanted to be totally natural. The only answer they had from the allopathic was steroids, just lifetime of steroids over and over again. Long story short, I was researching butyrate and inflammation of the gut and CK levels. And I just took one step back for some reason. I was like, I'm just going to do Akkermansia. I took the butyrate. I tried it with him. His stomach hurt so bad when he took it, he couldn't take it. And I was like, well, let's go to Akkermansia. And this was last year. I was like, I just got introduced to this product, Pendulum. It's great. Let's just try it. So we did. Anyway, his CK levels dropped from, it was around 29,000 at that point to 13,000 in a month. And I had been working with this kid for 6 months. So at that point, I was like, there's something here. I actually emailed, your medical director, and I was like, you won't believe this. He was like, wow,
That's really cool.
So his CK levels continue to go down. But, one of the things that I kept researching on, like, why, DMD is just chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, and, Akkermansia, as it has been shown to increase your short chain fatty acid production, particularly butyrate. Giving him the butyrate didn't work. It was the natural production of it that actually impacted these levels, I feel. I have no scientific proof except to say I gave it to him a month later. We were at half of what we had been battling.
Yeah, it's
And
incredible.
butyrate, we know, reduces NF-kappa B activation, and that's a key driver of this inflammation and in this disease in general. So just giving my own clinical testimony of the power of the gut and how I know it's not sexy. It's not sexy anymore, right? It's like everyone's on to the symptom of the problem. And even with GLP-1, we know it's the gut. We know. But I just think people always want the quick fix. So if I
Yeah.
can encourage practitioners listening today that regardless if your person is walking in on an injectable or trying to do something else, if you just add these products in with that GLP-1 program or your metabolic program, you will have astounding results, not just for weight loss, but all of the touch points that GLP-1 does, from neurological degeneration,
Yep.
cardiovascular, all of the things. So amazing stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, I know you and I talked about this before, but it doesn't need to be one or the other. And it's
Right.
really looking at the whole person. And I think the microbiome now, we've got so much, deeper understanding of all of this. And so it's an exciting area as practitioners. And for me, when in doubt, I start with the gut. I'm like, oh my God, you've got everything under the sun and I don't know what to do. Let's start with the microbiome because we know it's playing a role. And so thinking about what you said, like, that downregulation of NF-kappa B, we know a lot of the benefits around probiotics, and especially Akkermansia, as I mentioned, it's that production of interleukin 10. So again, you're getting the short chain fatty acids, which downregulate inflammation. You're getting the production of all these important signals. And so it's really profound what they can do. And it is important for us to start to consider these as part of our whole plan. And I think, these medications, statins, GLP-1 agonists, they're not going away. GLP-1 receptor agonists, interestingly enough, are showing very positive effects on the microbiome. Now, is it the GLP-1 receptor agonist or is it the weight loss and the blood sugar control? And so everything's coming out that they're beneficial, but how do we maintain that success? And how do we actually work with our own body's processes and our own body's mechanisms? And that really can amplify people's results. Maybe they don't need to take as much of these medications. Maybe we can save them a dollar here or there
A bit
too,
of money.
right?
Yeah. I love it. I'm so excited for this. So guys, don't forget to add this to your Get Healthy catalog. The other thing is we just released the VitaBoom technology, which is our pill packing technology, if you're listening as a Get Healthy user, and Pendulum is in the pill packing. So creating these cool customized
Wow.
boxes, I don't know if you can see it or where I need to put it for you to see it, but hang on, I'm going to drop my background, guys, because you kind of have to see this. It's really cool. This pill packing technology allows you to, instead of giving just pills or bottles, you can create these pill packs that have the Pendulum, Akkermansia, and whatnot in it. And so you got the Vitaboom box, you got your pill packs, puts the script on there. So that is available in your Get Healthy store, and Pendulum's in there. And so you can just build these GLP-1 gut enhancing protocols with your pill packing technology and
Love
hand
that.
this box and say, hey, you're on an injectable. That's wonderful. Let's start with your gut so you can maintain these changes. So absolutely. I think it's revolutionary what you guys are doing. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us on.
Get my background back up so I look real official. All right, guys, thanks for being here. Don't forget to add this to your catalog in the back. You just want to check into your clinical admin, go to product section, add Pendulum, in addition to adding it to your pill packs, and reach out to Pendulum for a wholesale account because you're going to
Yeah.
want to buy this yourself. And
And
you're
if you
going
have questions, we're here to help you.
okay. All right, Kara, thanks. I know you got an
Thank,
evening ahead of you. Thanks for being here.
thank you.